The Philippine National Police killed at least 32 drug suspects during a series of
32 ang napatay sa enkwentro sa one-time big-time operation ng Bulacan
He dreamed of being a policeman, and the police are the ones that killed his dreams.
the deadliest night of Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte's year-long war on drugs.
If they are obstructing justice, you shoot them.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories we're covering this week. The Philippines. Not content with attacking the media, President Duterte targets human rights workers and suggests police should do the same. Disappearing bylines. Where have all the labor reporters gone? And are they on their way back? Some media outlets in South Africa are changing hands, but don't expect them to change the way they cover the Zuma government. And hashtag happy birthday. What the president of the Philippines calls a war on drugs has for months now been a war on the poor, a war on those trying to report on the killings, and a war on human rights. The country is now 15 months into President Rodrigo Duterte's brutal crackdown on the drug trade. Last week was the deadliest so far. Police in and around Manila killed 58 alleged drug dealers and users in just 3 days. One of those fatalities, a 17-year-old, made headlines. Police say he was killed in a two-way firefight. Eyewitnesses, backed by CCTV footage, tell a different story. The president does not mince his words. He says he wants to kill as many people involved with drugs as possible. He dismisses the killing of children as collateral damage and lists his critics as public enemies. Journalists are among the people on that list, and NGO workers have also been moved into that category. Earlier this month, the president told the police on camera to shoot human rights workers who, quote, obstruct justice. Duterte clearly understands the role that such advocates play in the media food chain. Silencing them is just another way to keep a lid on this story. Despite his critics in the media, the polls say that Duterte remains popular with Filipinos. And for that, he may have bloggers and social media figures to thank. The so-called DDS, diehard Duterte supporters, have the president's back, denigrating his critics online, shaping public opinion. Our starting point this week is the capital, Manila. Police called it an encounter with a drug suspect, a shootout. The CCTV video suggests otherwise. It shows 17-year-old Kian Lloyd de los Santos getting dragged by police into this alley. Eyewitnesses say he was distraught, telling the police he had to go home, that he had school the next day. They say the police gave him a gun and told him to run. He was shot and killed, his body found here. It was just one death among the thousands killed in the Filipino war on drugs. But this particular killing and the story behind it have lingered in the mainstream news media and online in a way that others have not.
The reason why Kian's case has resonated is because it hit close to home. Kian could be our son, could be our brother, and the CCTV coverage actually showed that this boy was already subdued. So how could he have grappled with a gun, or how could he have fought off 2-3 policemen?
And at least 3 witnesses had come in, and they claimed that they saw Kian alive being led away.
Ganyan yung pagkakawak sa kanya, parang sinasakal siya eh. Hindi naman po namin iniisip na gagawin nila yun sa bata eh.
And that he was told to get a gun and to run. So it was a clear case of the police lying.
And if we just take a look at the visuals given by the CCTV camera, it would show that it could happen to any neighborhood, it could happen to any family.
Over the past 14 months, an estimated 5,500 Filipinos have been killed without trials or any semblance of due process on the orders of a president who says he wants all drug traffickers and users eliminated. Polls indicate that Duterte and his war on drugs remain popular. The president dismisses his critics in the news media, saying most of them are corrupt, on the take. And he holds human rights organizations, including the country's Commission on Human Rights, in a special sort of contempt. Duterte argues they protect drug dealers and recently repeated this warning that if human rights workers get in the way of the drug war, they should be shot.
If they are obstructing justice, you shoot them.
human rights groups are beginning to gain ground. So now he has to take them on. How about the media? Threaten the media outright, and human rights organizations. And for that matter, any organization that might be seen going against him. When you are a president who is predisposed to a dictatorial leadership, you are necessarily against human rights.
A lot of people have been echoing this message of we are criminal protectors. So it's all about driving a wedge between human rights defenders and also the public. So it's not only NGOs that's being attacked here. Actually, what is being attacked is the freedom to be able to receive and impart accurate, factual information.
Bias is in the eyes of the beholder. I think what you've seen is a government that wants to make sure that there is popular approval of its keystone policy, which is the drug war.
We can only agree on what is right and legal.
However, to do it without rule of law, without due process, brings us right smack into conflict with many numerous agreements of human rights charters that the Philippines has actually signed.
In its conflict with the media and NGOs, the Duterte government does not stand alone. It is buttressed by voices online, blogging or posting on Facebook. Some have been put on the government's payroll. Mocha Uson, an entertainer turned pro-Duterte blogger, has been hired by the president's communications team. We interviewed another blogger, RJ Nieto, who recently revealed he is now a paid consultant for the government. Nieto's writings align neatly with the government's messaging. He backs the drug war, trashes mainstream news outlets, and has launched personal attacks against certain media figures, setting off waves of nasty online trolling of those journalists. But that's different, he argues, than being part of the government's propaganda machine.
I'm not really sure what even a propaganda machine is. Just because you have the same political leanings, it doesn't mean that you work in one super organization. That is something that they haven't shown so far. Even those allegations that I, for example, spread fake news, if they think that we are some concerted effort and there's like a master puppeteer who controls all of us, then they better show evidence.
Anytime any journalist, when they report something that is perceived as negative to President Duterte, they are attacked viciously on social media. And whether it's real or made up, it then spreads in an exponential manner. When you say something 1,000,000 times, that then becomes truth. Truth can't catch up in situations like this.
Even before the elections, Duterte and his lieutenants have admitted that. They had this force of trolls and bloggers pledged to his presidency. They're not denying that. And because they observe no rules, just as Duterte does not, people who operate under certain restrictions of propriety, again, of decency, are at a disadvantage. In Mocha Uson and her crew are obviously orchestrated, you know, and the conductor is Mr. Duterte himself.
The Filipino media have proved unable to really change perceptions on this story. It wasn't their reporting, their constant documenting of the killings, or their raising of human rights issues that ended up putting police under investigation and putting the Duterte government on the defensive. It wasn't any of the media's past coverage that led to members of Congress, many of them firm allies of Duterte, to hold a public hearing triggered by the De Los Santos case. It was pure happenstance, the existence of a single CCTV camera, the emergence of about 2 seconds of real-time video that put the lie to the official version of one teenager's brutal killing and changed the story.
Whereas in the other killings, it's just the police version saying that, you know, that the criminals allegedly fought it out with them, and that's why they were killed. Whereas in the Kian case, a videotape was there, basically showing that, you know, he was killed. It's as simple as that. You know, they got caught.
Other media stories that are on our radar this week, in keeping with the theme from the Philippines of governments going after NGOs that can affect journalism, the authorities in Egypt have blocked access to the website of Reporters Without Borders. On August 17th, the Paris-based Press Freedom Group, which often features Egypt on its pages, said its site had gone dark in the country and that numerous attempts to get an explanation from the CC government had proved unsuccessful. The block on RSF happened shortly after it published a statement condemning the Egyptian authorities on the arbitrary detention of Mahmoud Abu Zayed, a photojournalist known as Shakan, who's been imprisoned without charge for the past 4 years. The head of the group's Middle East desk said that this digital blackout is not just a grave attack on freedom of information, it's also indicative of a fear on the part of the regime that an informed public could pose a threat to its stability. 3 months ago, dozens of Egyptian news sites were blocked, including Mada Masra, a critical outlet that reports in English and in Arabic. According to the Association for Freedom of Thought and Expression, an Egyptian NGO, the number of sites currently inaccessible in the country is now at more than 130. Ownership changes involving 2 of South Africa's more contentious media outlets were announced this past week. Out goes one controversial business family that strongly backed the South African government, replaced by a new owner with similar political views. Oak Bay Investments, a holding company owned by the Gupta family, announced it had reached a $34 million deal to sell ANN7, a news channel, and the New Age newspaper to Mzwaneli Manye, an outspoken supporter of President Zuma. The Guptas have been in the South African spotlight over their cozy relationship with the Zuma government. They say they're getting out of the news business to clear their name of what they call unfounded media allegations. Manye, who is financing his media acquisitions with loans from the Guptas themselves, said of ANN7 and the New Age, "These are 2 strong businesses which are full of potential and under the right external circumstances can become an increasingly important and relevant part of the South African media landscape." The critics aren't buying it. The opposition Economic Freedom Fighters Party has called Gupta-owned media propaganda machinery for the corrupt cartel, while Save South Africa, a civil society organization, said the sale was true to form for the crony capitalists who were clustered around Mr. Zuma. The diplomatic rift between the government of Qatar and the Gulf states blockading the country continues to play out in the region's media outlets, with some Gulf-based news channels taking editorial liberties with the story. This past week, the Emirati-owned channel Dubai TV fabricated a report saying the Qatari capital Doha had been hit with anti-government protests, resulting in the use of tear gas and the imposition of a curfew. The broadcast offered no video evidence, just the news reader saying the story came from sources within Qatari opposition. The Qatari government dismissed the report as false, adding the blockading countries are becoming increasingly desperate in their efforts to isolate Qatar. They are spending millions on creating fake news. That report came 1 week after Al Arabiya, a Saudi-owned channel based in Dubai, aired this simulated video which suggested what kind of military response might take place should commercial flights by Qatar Airways violate Saudi airspace.
إلا أن القانون الدولي يكفل أيضا للدول إسقاط أي طائرة تدخل أجواءها وتميز على أنها هدف.
Qatar says the broadcasting of that animated video violates international treaties and conventions and that it has lodged a complaint with the International Civil Aviation Organization. Here at the Listening Post, we spend a lot of time examining what's being reported in the news media. Sometimes, though, what's not being reported or what's no longer being reported is the real story. Case in point, the labor beat. Not that long ago, just about every American news organization had a labor specialist. Now, they're a rare breed. And when you consider that more than 150 million Americans are in full or part-time employment, it's a wonder that there aren't more stories about workers and the challenges they face in testing economic times. Some of the news space that used to be devoted to labor issues has been surrendered to market and business news, as media outlets abandon mass readership in favor of the more upscale, affluent audiences that their advertisers are chasing. And then there's the journalists themselves and the classified. Even though they share many of the economic concerns their readers have, they don't seem to identify with the working man or woman. The Listening Post's Will Yong now on the labor beat and representations of working-class Americans in the U.S. media.
That message is resonating with white working class voters.
Especially for working class white
Just
voters.
with this white working class vote. And what's interesting here...
In the aftermath of the unexpected election of President Donald Trump, the media attempted to provide answers. But implicit in every article, the premise of all that punditry was that journalists had to reconnect with something they had forgotten.
About the U.S. working class.
A whole class of Americans that the political establishment, along with their explainers in the media, had left behind.
Labor as an issue has been really absent from the media coverage. In a way, the media sort of feeds into this feedback loop of America thinking of itself as a non-class conscious society. We don't think of ourselves as working class. Even those of us who, could be categorized as working class or as even working poor.
What we have now is a media system that takes a 20,000-foot view of workers. They see them as statistics. They see them as exotic animals out in the wild of the country.
Want to go for a ride? Let's go.
They don't see what the everyday struggle is. They don't understand what it's like trying to keep food on the table. Most workers view media as the enemy.
You guys live in a different world, and instead of coming here and judging us, based on what we do, they kind of looked at us like, we were the dirt under their heel.
And when workers see themselves depicted in the media or not depicted, that deepens that divide.
During most of the 20th century, virtually every major US newspaper employed at least one reporter dedicated to the labor beat. Reporters who most likely walked from their local newsroom to the union halls where they sourced their stories. But over the decades, local papers merged or stopped their presses. Family-owned papers sold out to Wall Street, and stories about workers and unions increasingly made way for business and finance.
In the 1930s, you had this vibrant labor press. You had lots of unions funding publications, you had lots of subscribers funding publications. And that really led to a lot of organizing. When the Minneapolis General Strike happened in 1935, there were labor papers in 9 different languages. You don't have anything that's the equivalent of that today.
During the 1960s in particular, there was a lot of consolidation in the newspaper industry in America. By the time you get into the 1970s, most of them are owned by corporations that are publicly traded. And what newspapers then start to do is think about a different audience. It used to be all people, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And by the 1970s, it really had shifted to more upscale readers.
The distance between the average worker and the average executive is greater than ever, which leads to this imbalance in coverage also, where you get CEOs with cults of personality who become these figures who are profiled again and again, whereas the average worker will rarely receive that kind of attention.
Business reporting, whatever we call economics reporting now, is focused on financial markets. And we know from our everyday lives that financial markets is not where 99.9% of Americans live their lives.
It's a real hardship. I've got...
When US workers do attract media interest, US journalists seem interested in a certain kind of worker. One of Donald Trump's first promises after being elected was to protect jobs at the Carrier air conditioning factory in Indianapolis, jobs that were threatened when the company announced a plan to move production to Mexico. Trump promised to protect American jobs, and the US media served up an image of the American worker that fitted his narrative.
You saw mostly white men who were actually the minority of those Carrier plant workers.
So you believed Mr. Trump when he made his promise?
Yes, I believed him 100%. That's why I voted for him.
About 50% of those workers at that Indianapolis plant were African American. You didn't really see this in the stories. And about half of those workers also were women. And you didn't see them in the stories either. And I think that says a lot about America and who's actually the working class. It's much broader than we think about. And it's not just guys wearing a blue collar and a hard hat.
There's been some romanticization under Trump of sort of the average white male worker in manufacturing or in coal mining.
It is dark, dangerous, tough work. Telling the economy here in Pennsylvania.
Demographically, home care workers and domestic workers are faster growing sectors of the economy. So a renewed interest in work doesn't necessarily mean that reporters are following the economic data so much as they're following political storylines.
While membership of labor unions and strikes in the US are at historic lows, high-profile disputes between employers and organised labour do still make headlines. Communications workers, teachers, transport workers and nurses are among those who have gone on strike this year and last for better pay and conditions. But when the media tell these stories, the question is, whose priorities do they put first?
Say a strike happens, especially a transit strike, they first go to the consumers who are upset.
It's going to be a real nightmare. I just want to close my eyes and go to sleep and not think about it.
So you will see television interviews, you will see pictures of people who are angry because they're stuck at the airport, they're stuck at a train station, they can't get their bus to the next city, and they're mad about it. And that becomes the essential frame of that story.
A strike would severely balloon travel times for most commuters and shut down the trip to work for others.
Often, unions are seen as intransigent, trying to squeeze whatever they can out of a contract. And there's an increasing tendency to blame workers for everything.
Well, this is kind of a bummer way to start the morning if you are taking the bus, because obviously it will affect your schedule. But
these are people striking for their livelihoods. Why shouldn't they absolutely have the right to do that?
Workers in the South are starting to sense their value. They're starting to engage much more in collective action and realize that they're not getting a piece of the pie. So you look at Tennessee last year, it gained 12,000 union members. Mississippi gained 10,000. North Carolina gained 6,000. Right here in Kentucky, we gained 3,000 union members. No one's covering this story except us.
So there are signs that traditional workplace organisation could be on the cusp of a comeback, and that working class concerns are creeping back into the consciousness of the news media and their audiences. Take the Fight for 15 campaign, which has won significant national media coverage and a $15 minimum wage in some US states.
I think the Fight for 15 has really figured out a formula that worked of being in the streets and making noise. They're more of a movement, which means that they brought in all kinds of minimum wage workers, and journalists understood that storyline and could follow that narrative.
I think there's a growing awareness that issues of inequality are about work, right, and about workplace equity. And I think that a greater willingness to understand how these issues intersect in our lives is coming from younger segments of the media who have experienced some of that precariousness themselves.
If there were more reporters and editors who came from working class backgrounds, I think the identification with workers would be stronger. Workplace issues are the ones that affect most readers' lives in real ways, and you can see that reflected in increase in readership for stories about labor. I think the audience is really there.
Relative newcomers like BuzzFeed have made the Labour beat a full-time role, a sign that media outlets may be rediscovering ground that they've neglected for too long. Because stories about the working class, labour, workers have never gone away. They just need journalists to tell them.
Finally, last week marked the 10th anniversary of the birth of the Twitter hashtag. Initially the suggestion of a user, which was then adopted by the company, it's reached the point where more than 125 million hashtags are shared on Twitter every day. And then there's the use and abuse of hashtags on Facebook, Instagram, and in some lame real-life conversations. We'll leave you now with a list of some of the more historic hashtags that over the past decade have helped drive, and in some cases define, major news stories. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.